following seminar was recorded for a live audience at the University of York. In the seminar, we cover the subject of the imposter phenomenon, feeling like a fraud, feeling like, compared to other people, your efforts aren't as good, the feeling that you're about to get found out and thrown out of your workplace. The seminar specifically focuses on the subject of luck, which is one chapter of my forthcoming book on the imposter phenomenon called You Are Not a Fraud. As the lecture plays out, what you'll see is this link at the bottom of the page. You can go along there. There are even more free resources beyond this seminar. And there's a link there that allows you to sign up to show your interest, show your support in that forthcoming book. And when it's released, you'll be the first to know. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. And without further ado, please enjoy this seminar on the imposter phenomenon. Our dearest Adeline, when you were a tiny baby, you loved the bath. You were almost ready to talk. You were excited to walk. But your love of splashing in the bath was very clear. You would look up to us with those amazing blue eyes, smile as wide as your ears, and splash, splash, splash. But you, our cute and curious little girl, also loved to play with a little toy turtle at bath time. When you weren't splashing with your handies, you would reach for the little green turtle, slowly pick it up with your wee fingers and thumbs, only to chew on it like you chewed on everything back then. When you watched on as your magic mind grew to become our clever little girl, splashing and finding and picking up her very own turtle toy in her big girl bath, you probably think we're being very silly. And you would be right to tell us that it was easy to find that turtle toy in the bath. You're right, it is easy, and this is a bit silly. But we tell you this now, our beautiful and blossoming girl, because we want to share with you something that is very, very important. Something we've had on our minds ever since you were a blue-eyed baby. Your little turtle toy from the bath was about the size of your baby handy, about the size of a golf ball. Imagine that it wasn't the size of a golf ball, but the size of a wee peanut. If we threw the little peanut-sized turtle toy in the bath, you, our brilliant love, would still find it. It would be a bit more difficult finding a toy in the bath the size of a peanut rather than one the size of a golf ball, sure, but we know you would find it. We are still being very silly, but stay with us. Please keep reading. Imagine instead of throwing your wee peanut-sized turtle toy into the bath, that it was thrown into the deep blue sea. That's a big bath, a very big bath. You would find it much harder to pick up your toy because you probably wouldn't know where in the deep blue sea it went. You could splash, splash, splash for all the days and all the nights, and it would still be hard to find that toy again. You might even say it was too hard or impossible. We tell you this silly story, our gorgeous angel, because to us, finding you was like finding a tiny bath toy in the big blue sea. It was almost impossible, but we found you. And to us, you are the most special person in the whole world. You might forget our funny story about the bath, but always remember this. As you grow up to be even taller, even more amazing, you will find things you love, find things that make you happy. Find things that make you sad. Things that you find easy and things harder than getting your wee toy back from the sea. Your life will bring all of these things and much, much more. And for all of it, whether you are laughing or crying, we will be here for you. We will help you be whatever you want to be. Because to us, you are our impossible little joy from the big blue sea. You mean the world to us now, and we love and want the world to be yours. Wherever you want to go, wherever you want to be, we will be in your heart, loving you more than you could ever know. Yours, with all the biggest kisses and cuddles, Mummy and Daddy. Hopefully not how you expected me to begin today. Welcome to those of you who have just joined us for the second half. There's a very good reason that I've told you that story. That was a photocopied version of a letter I wrote to our now 3-year-old daughter, who now looks like this with our infant son. We wrote that off the back of some things that I'd found out over the course of this journey to understand more about the imposter phenomenon. And I wrote that story for her, which she hasn't read yet and won't until she's much older. We wrote that on her naming day, and to share that with our family and friends at the time, to share with them the same story that I want to tell you now, that everyone here is like finding that little turtle toy in the bath. And that's the one thing, if nothing else, that I would like my daughter and of course now our son to know. And I would like you to remember parts of that before you leave here today. Now, what I want to tell you in what is a relatively short talk compared to others that I'll share with you that are now hosted on YouTube that tell other parts of this story. I'm sharing this short talk to get across that one message of how impossible everyone here is, full stop, and how it relates to those of us who feel like imposters and feel like they don't belong in the workplace. So let me tell you that story, not in the form of that letter, but in the form of an animation that I've put together for you that I hope will work now. He says, through bated breath and famous last words, if we start here, then let's think about a carving of our world. And not traversing all of it, but think about two people who might in their own way have grown up and carved out a segment of that world. Their travels might have brought them to, let's say, a fifth or a quarter of the world, something like that. Each in their own way, living their own lives and their own paths. The chances of those two meeting, you might say, is roughly 1 in 20,000. But let's not stop there, because we might be looking at the roughly 1 in 10 chance that those two people strike up a conversation, decide to go on a date, or the 1 in 10 chance that they decide to go on a second date, or stay together long enough to go on more dates, and the coin flips worth of a chance that they stay together long enough to have children, which on its own might be a roughly 1 in 2,000 chance. But let's take that further still, because when you combine even those two rudimentary calculations, you're looking at a 1 in 40 million chance that you are the product of that union. And if you look, not in too much detail, I dare say, at the birds and the bees, maybe female eggs of the order of 100,000 produced in a lifetime, and 400 trillion sperm. And the chances of that alone are upwards of 1 in 400 quadrillion. But that's not at all factored in the story of evolution and the fact that not a single one of your direct ancestors has perished before the chance came about to produce you. That in itself is the most ridiculous number we can estimate yet, 1 in 10 to the power of 45,000. But that still isn't the end of the story. Because if I cut out some of the calculations now and take you straight to the punchline, if you consider all of these random events, 1 in 10 to the power of roughly 2 million is the chance that any of us were born. There's only 10 to the power 80 atoms in the universe. That gives us some inkling, some way to scratch the surface of not the randomness of any of us being here, but the sheer ridiculousness of it ever happening at all. The randomness of those numbers, the stupid gargantuan size of them, tells you that the story of every one of us is the story of luck. It's more than a coin flip, more than a million coin flips. But nonetheless, here we all are. All of that story is nice, but the number we need to remember is this one that none of us can fathom. That's the conservative estimate of any one of us being born, let alone making it into adulthood. And that's not factoring in any family that's considered a child who might not flourish in their own home, but is adopted into a flourishing home. None of this considers that, or any other circumstance of life. And all of this leads us to talk about the main story, the thing that I've been researching for the past 5 years, which is the imposter phenomenon, where you think you know so much little than others around you, and forget the truth that in fact what you know is complementary to those around you. It makes you feel like you're underqualified, you're not cut out for the job, you shouldn't be there, someone's about to find you out and chuck you out of your workplace. It makes you feel like everything that you've done to get here is down to luck, and that luck is a bad thing. And part of the story of researching the imposter phenomenon, one thing I want to share with you is a number like this one, which out of 100 was the first thing that gave me a sense of what it meant to feel like an imposter. 0 is never feeling that way. 100 is chronic instances where it's very severe and you do feel like your luck is about to run out at any moment. Over the past 5 years, I've managed to engage over 800 people to look at the same metric, to look at the same way of getting an idea of how much they would feel like an imposter. And in doing so, what we've found is that we can all take a deep breath and realise that we're not alone. If you've ever felt this way, you are most certainly not alone. This graph here shows along the x-axis that very same number from 0 to 100. It's called the Clance Imposter Phenomenon scale. Again, all we need to know for now is that at 0, that's an experience that isn't part of your life, and up towards 100, it's something that might overcast much of what you do. You feel like an imposter all the time. For the people that we engaged, we found that most people were in well excess of 50 out of 100. No survey is perfect. In fact, all surveys are filters to bring forward people who are attracted to the idea in the first place. So this on its own isn't surprising. But remember, this is more than 800 people saying this. The key point is that none of us are alone. Many people feel not only that they've ever felt like an imposter, but that it happens often. It happens all the time, in fact. Another way that we've carved up the same data to tell more of this same story. And what you're seeing here is a video play out of feedback sent directly to all of our participants, where they'll see graphs very similar to the one I've showed you. They will see the entire distribution in an anonymised sense, of course, and see their own score placed in that story. And you can go further and ask, how would you associate your story with an emoji that in some ways displays the emotion? And even for this one example, there's a massive range of scores associated with just one facial feature. And then it's feedback like this that we've sent out to invite others to come forward. So it's not just that we can put the imposter experience into numbers. It's even more than the fact that we can see that there are many people who feel like this in a severe or chronic sense, but also that you can't actually rely on someone telling you that through their face. You cannot rely on facial expression to read how someone is feeling or what they might tell you. And in fact, there's a large body of psychology literature that says that there are many emotions that don't even exist in some cultures, and that the same facial expression in two opposite ends of the world might mean entirely different things. What we found here is consistent with that message. And telling you just one of the 20 questions that we asked up front in the study that we ran over the past several years was to ask people to look at the phrase, "I sometimes feel my success is down to luck." They answered this question from 1 to 5. 1 is, "I don't agree with that at all." 5, of course, is, "That is exactly my experience. All of this is down to luck." And when you look at just how many people have answered that, you can see that the vast majority of those in our study, and the numbers have creeped up since this graph was made, the vast majority of people will answer 4 or 5. Most of those people who feel like imposters feel like part of that experience is just all luck. They've not done any hard work. They've not taken advantage of their place in time. All of it is just coin flips. All of it is putting luck in a horrible light, in a terrible frame. None of it considers the story of any of us and those ridiculous numbers of getting here. And one thing I'm not sharing in detail here that I've gone into detail in my forthcoming book on this subject is to take any random individual from any point in time, be that someone in your immediate circle or someone famous. I show here on the left-hand image Sir Francis Drake, who from Elizabethan times is an infamous voyager of the seas, to say the very least. The image of the woman on the right-hand side is his distant descendant, Lady Elliot Drake. And some 400 years apart, what you can actually see here is that they're both actually wearing the same heirloom, the same medallion from the Drake family. Now that in itself is just a quirk of history. It might sound like it's got nothing to do with what I've just been telling you for the past 15 minutes. But in the story of the Drake family that Lady Elliot Drake put together in the early 1900s to tell the story of the Drake family from the 1300s onwards, she told the story of how Sir Francis Drake's name was passed down over the ages, which is a common thing to happen. It happens in everyday families as well as the heights of society in years gone by. But it wasn't a simple case that Sir Francis Drake could pass his name down 5 generations to another Sir Francis Drake, 5 positions removed, and it be the son of the son of the son of the son of the son. In fact, Sir Francis Drake himself never had any children and died of dysentery far from home before he ever got the chance. It was his brother's children who carried on the name. And then their children, it wasn't the first name Francis in their family, but the Francis who was named after the first Francis who died in childhood. This passing of a name is very rarely a simple case of from parent to child. And in many cases, it's random events, very much like the randomness of any of us being here, that would allow anything like a name to be passed on at all. But also, going away from famous figures, I've talked a little bit about my own family. You'll see again on the inset the same image of my young daughter Adeline, which I shared at the beginning. The people that you can see in this photograph are my paternal grandparents, and thankfully my dear papa here managed to hold Adeline just 4 weeks before his own death. But what struck me about that photograph when I first took it was, by God, these are 2 pairs of eyes 4 generations apart looking at one another. What has had to happen, not just for Adeline to be here, but for Archie, my papa, to be able to hold her. Numbers that I couldn't possibly fathom. And I would challenge each and every one of you, no matter what your family circumstance is, to find those stories that are close to you and family or friends. And I promise you, you will find the random events that, had another fork in the road been taken, would probably mean that you wouldn't be sitting here right now. And even to challenge myself to take my own advice, there are those of you in the room who will know this gentleman, who's a previous head of department here at the University of York. This was as simple as me Googling previous heads of department at York for this trip today, and to pick one at random. I made it a wee bit easier. I chose the first name that I could find on the list, and Sir Richard Norman came up, who's a head of department for a long time, and then latterly, I believe, was Chief Scientific Advisor to the Ministry of Defence. A big hitter in his day. Did many things that I don't have time to do justice to. But he wouldn't be here if his mother hadn't survived being the youngest of 9 children. Just one fact from one name picked out of the air that happens to be associated with here. Very quickly, within 20 minutes, found me looking at an obituary and a biography of Professor Norman and finding just one fact that, if it had changed, would mean that he wouldn't be here, let alone contribute in the way that he did to the University of York and his generation. Again, I challenge you to do this for your own life, your own family, and your own circle of friends. In that way, you might be a little bit more like Richard Feynman and play great fun with your life and indeed your science, and perhaps be less serious than the others in the same room, some of whom you may recognise. And that's where I would like to end this short lecture. I've put up this QR code here because this is a short lecture as part of a series where I tell more of this story of what we've found out en route to understanding the imposter phenomenon and why it's not the imposter syndrome. You can find all of that on my website and on YouTube. This is a new part of that story, a new lecture for you, audience, today, and part of my small way of thanking you for making the effort to be here. As Luke said, I'd love to spend the rest of the time now in conversation, taking your questions and hopefully being able to answer them, whether it's on luck and framing that more positively, or any broader part of what it means to feel like an imposter. Thank you very much.
If you have a question for Marc, Marc is going to just repeat it so that the people on Zoom can hear through the microphone, so don't think he's just taking his time to think. Sure he is. So yeah, any questions? Go on, Alyssa, go on, kick us off.
Have you observed in your analysis that the degree at which people experience the imposter phenomenon wanes or changes over time, and perhaps can you comment on what the factors are that allow that to change in one direction or another?
An excellent question. So for those listening in, Alyssa's referring to the broader study results, and in terms of the scores that people have, 0 to 100, and how much they feel like an imposter, the question boils down to, is that a static score, or are there ways to change that score for the better over time? Thankfully, I wouldn't be writing about it if the answer was no, so yes. And most of what I've been writing about are the things that have helped me. When I moved from my PhD to my postdoc position, that was the first time I'd moved from one cohort, one family of co-workers to another. The first time I'd ever had the excuse to compare myself very broadly against others of my generation, to think that they were better than me, had better papers than me, were more widely published than me, were smarter than I was, had better ideas than I did, and were all just ready to pounce and find me out for being a fraud and kick me out of my postdoc. I didn't even know what it was called back then, but that's what kick-started it all. And the reason I tell you that is because one of the major things that I found helpful, and indeed through the literature on the imposter phenomenon, is recommended as being helpful to those suffering from it, is to document it. write a journal, write a diary. As simple as that sounds, there's a large body of separate literature in the psychology space that shows the positive influence of getting the thoughts out of your head onto paper. Without anything fancier than that, there are other things you can do, but one of the first things you can do, which is entirely within your control, is simply to look at yourself as if, from an out-of-body experience, look how that person has experienced these imposter feelings on a particular occasion. And over time, you will see more instances and patterns emerging for yourself, because the reason it's not a syndrome is because it's not the same exact diagnosable thing in every instance. It's a collection of experiences and feelings which will be more severe for some than for others. So some people will feel the component of luck more than others, whereas some other people will focus more on feeling completely underqualified to be in a room. These things are under the umbrella of the imposter experience, but it's feeling different dimensions of that that mean that it's very, very powerful for you to be able to document that in your own way. And that's why, even for myself, to get back to the other part of Alyssa's question about the scores and how they can change over time, none of these scores are ever static. You could take the same test a month from now and feel differently. Part of that, of course, would be controlled for any bias that you may feel with some familiarity of the questions and just a deep ingrained wish to score a certain way because we've all grown up taking exams our entire life. But nonetheless, part of that reflects the reality that over the course of time, you will find more tools that work for you and will allow you to reflect on the same exercise in a more positive light, to take your imposter score from a high one to a lower one. Mine started in the 80s. I showed you a number that was around 70. That's taken me several years to do that. And the way that I've done it might be different for everyone else in this room, but what I've tried to collect in my writing is some of the main things that have come back to help me time and time again. Writing is one of them. Reflecting on how ridiculous it is that I'm ever here at all is another. Thanks, Alyssa.
How do you make the distinction between something that is like purely by chance or that's been influenced by things that you've done?
So what I've shared is things that are more or less entirely by chance. There's a wonderful book by the journalist Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers, which in it describes generational influences and what people are even able to do given their place in time. So typically for us in our generation, you might find on average that parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were in more menial, laborious jobs than what we have the opportunity to do. And so influences like that mean that we have the opportunity to do certain things and influence our position more so than previous generations might. That's one example of how your actions can play into it. But your actions, this was my very tenuous link to my lecture earlier today, which was on following mistakes in research. Breeding the mindfulness in yourself to realise that you have the power, maybe not to control what's happening, but how you respond to what is happening and how you follow that. That's another very positive way that your own actions can have a parallel influence alongside all the randomness that we can't control. I hope that helps.
You spoke a little bit about how for you the experience of moving to your postdocs
Yes.
was where you first noticed it. And I was just wondering whether you have a sense of, in most people's career paths, whether certain points where this crops up more and whether we could be doing more, say, with almost preemptive training or awareness to prevent others coming through the pipeline to experience the same thing.
So again, repeating for those on Zoom, can we identify points in time where imposter experiences are more likely to happen? Transition points in career, for example. I've given you one example. So career transition en masse in general, be that academia or in industry or those in the entrepreneurial world, any change from one group of people to another can trigger such experiences or bring them out for the first time. But one of the things that I've focused on writing about in great detail is that I realise there's a lot of sister phenomena, if I can put it that way, by other names, that actually in some cases better describe in specific detail the imposter phenomenon as manifest in academia or in education. For example, one of my previous lectures, which is online, focuses on something called the big fish, little pond effect, where the feeling of going from one academic circle or one institution to another, or one level of education to another, can have a really serious detrimental impact on not how someone performs, but how they review their own performance. So that manifests, for example, in, quite controversially, those who are in institutions that are higher ranked on league tables. That can play out to manifest a pressure that doesn't exist in similar schools that are lower ranked on some nominal ranking scheme. And so even although those in a higher ranked school may in some dimension achieve more, given various other factors, those learning the exact same stuff in another school that doesn't have that pressure will feel better about how they're performing. In other words, you can feel like a tiny, tiny fish if you're swimming in the biggest ponds. You can feel like you're in shark-infested waters. So that's called the big fish, little pond effect, but much about what is said about that rings very true with how you would describe the imposter experience. So to get to an actionable part of your question, what can we do, is realise that perhaps a lot of those coming into the doors of the university for the first time from from school into undergraduate, many of them will have performed and even excelled at the school level and will be scared witless when they come through the door by no fault of their own. And they won't even know why. But it's this big fish, little pond effect, which can then roller coaster into other parts of the imposter experience and useless comparisons between yourself and other people.
Yeah, I think that's quite evident in my experience as well, because I've moved from lots of different institutions, and when you move to a different institution with a different group of people, there's a different group of expectations, there's different house rules, etc., and you feel completely out of like a fish out of water. And then as you grow, you start to realise that actually it's not you, it's just you're learning to adapt to a new system, and that's how it goes.
Absolutely.
And actually having to remind yourself every time you move. And it's not just moving institutions, as you say, every new level, every new paradigm brings a different set of expectations, which you obviously judge yourself against. And often we judge ourselves against the people whose shoes we're filling as well. And they've had the experience in which to build their own pond, essentially. So anyway, that resonated with me quite a lot. Caitlin, I think you had a question?
I did. Does your research take into account the mental health of other participants and whether or not that actually increase your score? So they're like, say if you had anxiety,
Yes.
take it different. Something like that. Is that like evident in it? Or?
Yeah. Really quite a profound question, actually, and something that surprised me. So again, for those listening in, does a study pertaining to look solely at the imposter experience actually catch other things that might be going on at the same time, or be conflated with other mental health challenges that are not the imposter experience? So the example you gave was anxiety. One thing I've not shown today is that there's another part of this whole survey we did where we allowed people to openly express their own stories. So no scales, no scoring from 1 to 5 or 0 to 100. How did you deal with an experience? What was an example, etc. And with all of that text, hundreds of thousands of words, we analysed that. And one of the top words that comes out from over 800 responses is anxiety. So you're spot on with that example, that can ride alongside the more specific feelings of being an imposter, is anxiety more broadly. There's a Venn diagram of overlap here where some parts of it are shared, other parts which are entirely distinct. Another more curious example is there are some people who came forward for the study looking for answers for something else, and were using this as an experiment for themselves to see if what they were feeling was the imposter experience. In a few extreme cases, we actually had people come forward who were more likely to be suffering from post-traumatic stress. So something traumatic, life-changing that had gone on earlier in life, and they had been reliving that. But it wasn't necessarily to do with feeling like a fraud or feeling that they were lucky to be where they were. So we have, good evidence at this point to say that it's actually worthwhile us repeating, rephrasing, redressing what the imposter experience is, because it's not as clear-cut, even 40 years into the body of research that exists. It's not clear-cut to everyone what it actually is and what they're experiencing versus what this particular pigeonhole might tell them. Excellent question, thank you.
Are there any positive self-affirmations you tell yourself to sort of get over the imposter?
Yes, but you can't. The question is, can you give yourself positive affirmations to get over the imposter experience? I emphasize get over. I don't mean to shoot that down. It's a really excellent question because you've picked up on one of the most overused parts of addressing the issue, which is to frame it in a way that you get over it, that you can cure it, you can crush it, you can smash it, you can get rid of it. All of these terms sell books very well, but they don't address the reality, which is that if you frame your approach as being able to get rid of it, you're setting yourself up for the fall of when it comes back, because other things will happen in your life that will put you in situations that you can't predict that might lead to a different variation on the same imposter theme. And so imagine you go into that thinking, oh, I thought I'd given myself these affirmations to have cured it or smashed it or got rid of it. The affirmation that works best to start, regardless of any specific affirmations, to realize that what you're doing is managing it. You're not trying to cure it. This is an old friend that could be with you for your entire life and is likely to be that way. Every mentor, or indeed direct line manager I've ever had, has joked that when I've said out loud, I feel this way, it doesn't change. These are folks in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who have all said the same thing. It doesn't go away. What changes is how you play with it. So I'd say, rather than a specific affirmation, start with pivoting how you actually address that question. Really, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is arguably the one thing that I've been challenged by the most when I've been talking about this to people, is that you're not trying to cure it. This is part of the human condition. You're not trying to lobotomize yourself with something here. Social comparison is part of how we all move forward. There's parts of the imposter experience and the comparison element of it that's actually good, because you want to be in a room where you're not necessarily the smartest person. Maybe someone's just a little bit ahead of you, because you've then got something tangible to aim for to help you grow. Where that takes a sour turn is if you then start comparing on unjustified grounds, or making comparisons between chalk and cheese, where it's not you and someone who's just a little bit ahead of you, but maybe someone who's had an entire different experience in getting into the same room, and any comparison you make isn't actually fair. So everything you do, if you feel the imposter experience is about managing it and learning to live with it, not trying to get rid of it.
I just have a quick question on your survey methodology.
Yes.
Do you collect any data about social factors of participants? And if you do you see any trends and correlations between socioeconomic background, gender, etc., and self-reported imposter?
Sure. Another important question with regards to survey methodology and whether, apart from the metrics, do we collect information on social background, socio-economic status, gender, upbringing, etc. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yes is the short answer. So we've collected information like where is someone in the world, where are they working at the time of studying it, gender of course, be that someone who wants to share what their gender is or not. So we've collected a wide range, and we've done this based on what to my knowledge was best psychological study practice at the time. So this was just going back a couple of years. And we've collected information with regards to ethnicity as well, age. The most talked about one, if I can come to it, which is I might dare say on other people's lips in the room, is gender. This, I suspect at this stage, is probably one of the most misunderstood parts of it. I find that very difficult to say out loud, because the assumption is that it's more prone in women than men. I think there is a chance that that is conflated with the fact that women find it easier to come forward and talk about it than men do. Very, very surprising. I didn't expect it. All of the pop culture articles on this that review other research would suggest otherwise. What I think they're doing is conflating how people deal with these things. And I am very careful not to generalize too much, because what we've found in this study is that we've got 800 answers and 800 stories. No two are alike. So everything is individual. But there is an element where you can clearly see that, for example, we've got 2/3 women coming forward for this study and 1/3 male, roughly speaking. There are other studies like that. I've grown to have colleagues who work in different departments outside of chemistry around the world who study this more regularly than I do. I'm doing this entirely outside of university work. They find the same challenge at the outset of their research, such that they have to actually specifically ask more men to come forward. But when you actually try to normalize the data and compare how high the scores are for the imposter experience, there's very, very little difference at all. So what we're actually picking up is differences, not in scores, but how people come forward. You also asked not about gender, but social background, socioeconomic status, upbringing, geography. These are less clear, but there is some data to suggest that those from Middle Eastern countries report lower scores than those in more Western countries. But that's far less conclusive. What we had most data for to look at most closely was gender. And in terms of a practical output for that, yeah, I think we have to be careful, clear, considerate that no two people in the same room will want to approach the issue the same way. And that's a challenge for us as leaders as well, and those of you in the room who are growing to be leaders and want to lead your own teams, because these are things that we need to be aware of, that every time we have a one-to-one meeting with someone, male, female, otherwise, from rich background, poor background, we can't really assume that they're going to approach the issue in the same way and assume that we can help two people in the same way. There's a challenge in leadership to say that there is no clean-cut pigeonhole with which we can put people into. Very, very difficult. I'm glad you asked that. And hopefully, as you can hear as I ramble on, that it's not a solved problem.
He says, when I started my PhD last year, every fellow student I spoke to experienced some form of this phenomenon, some more severely than others. This is the first time I've seen someone talking about it. It's comforting to see, so thank you. Why do you think we don't talk about this more?
Why don't we speak about the imposter experience? Some people think they're alone. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't know what to call it when I first experienced it. So I felt like I probably was the only one. And it wasn't until I started collecting data and reading stories from famous people that I'd followed that I realized that wasn't the case. So I think one reason that people don't speak about it is because they feel like they're the only one and there is no one. to speak to who can share any similar experience. The other, which perhaps relates to the last question, is shame. Whether that's the imposter phenomenon or not, and as openly as we speak about all mental health issues nowadays compared to previous generations, there is still an element of shame. And I dare say, I think that there's differences in how we should approach those issues at the gender level and others in the socio-economic dimensions. So feeling loneliness is one, feeling shame is another. There's other parts to that, but to leave it there, to honour a short answer, forget everything else if you wish, but please do realise that you're not alone.
Can we all join me in thanking Marc for what's been really excellent?